You know, when I was in at Fort Huachuca a week ago tomorrow, I was talking to some local businesses. They're not involved in the defense industry, but very much affected by it. I talked to a woman who runs a car dealership, and she hasn't had an order for a car in almost a month. And why? Because people don't know if they're going to have a job or if their job is going to be cut by 20%. Let me just ask one quick question of you, Lieutenant General Davis. I appreciate your testimony. We have taken, I think, a very irresponsible approach to our fiscal crisis. And just as our constituents, my constituents, could not cut their budget by 10% without going into foreclosure if they cut their mortgage or having their car repossessed if they cut that, neither can companies and neither can our Department of Defense. So I want to ask you, General, how do you build 90% of an airplane? And how do you build 90%, in the case of the Navy, of a submarine? How do you make these decisions about which programs and assets to fund and which to leave behind? How will you determine the priorities given the situation we are facing, which hopefully still can be reversed in due course? But if it does not change, how do you make these decisions? What priorities will you be looking at from the Air Force perspective moving forward if nothing changes?
Yes, sir. I think it starts back where our Chief and Secretary have testified that there's some very key priorities within the United States Air Force, and it starts with modernization. We have fighters that are approaching 25 years old, trainers that are 40 years old, bombers that are in excess of 30 years old. So we've had to take what we have within our current modernization budget of roughly $35, $37 billion a year and try to figure out where those priorities. Our top three priority programs, the tanker, the bomber, the F-35, are about 15% of that budget. And it's clearly imperative that, again, back to if we're going to maintain the missions you've given the United States Air Force, that those have to be modernized. So that means that other programs of lower priority, if we're given the flexibility, will have to pay that 10% that will drop from those programs at some point. And it'll be very insidious as we go through this. As you take 10% out of the F-35 program, you lose a couple of airplanes this year, and then you lose a couple more next year. And then the challenge as we go through that program on the out years, when we ramp up production, it gets quite significant numbers. So it starts with the priorities the nation has given the Air Force. It starts with how the Chief and Secretary put those priorities into play within our budget, and then we go execute the programs to meet those, and we decide where we fill in that 10% and from what program it comes from. And that bottom 20 to 30% of our modernization budget will be the first casualties of those programs.